Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are trying to cut through some of the noise around a really enduring and often pretty emotional debate here in America, immigration.
It really is.
Yeah, and it's not new. As far back as 1931, the social reformer Edith Abbott pointed out that the whole idea of immigration increasing crime is, quote, almost as old as the colonies.
Wow. Yeah, that really puts it in perspective. It's a sentiment that just keeps sparking intense discussion, doesn't it?
It does. It often seems to happen without maybe the full historical context or a deep dive into the data.
Which makes it so easy to misunderstand.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack this complex issue. We're going to look at the history, particularly the links or perceived links to crime.
Right.
Then we'll dive into the current policy landscape, which has seen some, well, pretty major shifts recently.
Definitely.
And finally, we'll zoom out to look at the bigger economic and social impacts. The goal is really to deliver some clear, maybe even surprising insights and leave you with a properly well-informed perspective.
And to do that, we've gathered quite a bit of material. We're drawing from a historical economic research paper, a pretty comprehensive overview of recent policy actions, and also some academic lecture notes that explore the theories behind it all, economic, social, political.
Okay, great. Let's dive in then. Let's start back in the early 20th century. This period comes up a lot in these discussions about immigration and crime.
It does. That perception that immigrants bring higher crime rates, it's just incredibly persistent.
And back then, there were actually major government investigations looking into this, weren't there? The Dillingham Commission and later the Wickersham Commission in '31.
That's right. They were set up specifically to examine these links. And what's really striking, I think, is that both of those early commissions, despite what a lot of the public probably thought, they found, and I'm quoting here, no satisfactory evidence that crime was more prevalent among the foreign-born.
No satisfactory evidence. But you mentioned our economic paper takes a slightly different view when reevaluating.
Well, it suggests the picture might have been a bit more complex. It sort of contrasts with those earlier findings and even some more recent research, actually.
Okay, so that's a crucial distinction. What made it so tricky to get a clear picture back then? And, how did this reevaluation find something different?
Well, assessing criminality, it's incredibly difficult even now. You're often stuck relying on recorded things like arrests, convictions.
Right, not necessarily actual crime happening.
Exactly. And that opens the door to all sorts of biases, like racial prejudice potentially influencing who gets arrested.
Sure.
Although it's worth noting, some studies back then, like in Chicago and Philadelphia, they did find that the ratio of convictions to arrests didn't seem to vary significantly based on whether someone was native-born or foreign-born, or their ethnicity.
Interesting. So, okay, let's talk specifics. The age crime curve, this idea that crime peaks in young adulthood. How did that look for immigrants versus natives back then?
Right. So for native-born white males around that time, like the early 1900s, commitment for major offenses tended to peak in their early 20s. That's pretty typical.
Okay.
But for foreign-born white males, looking at data from 1904, that peak was actually a bit higher, and it came earlier, around 18 or 19 years old.
Higher and earlier. What might that tell us?
Well, it raises an important question. Nearly half of those foreign-born individuals in that young age group, 18-19, were very recent arrivals.
Oh, okay.
So this could suggest, and the paper floats this idea, that things like adjustment or culture conflict might have played a role, perhaps contributing to more serious crimes for that specific group right when they arrived.
Makes sense. But you also said the picture changed over time.
Yes, and that's crucial. By 1930, the situation had really shifted. By then, foreign-born individuals were generally less likely than native-born people to be incarcerated for major offenses.
Less likely. Okay, so the data definitely evolved. But what about minor offenses? Was the story different there?
It was, yeah. Commitment rates for things like vagrancy, drunkenness, those were actually higher for the foreign-born, particularly for men maybe in their 40s and 50s.
Why would that be?
Well, it often reflects the sort of discretionary nature of arrests for those kinds of offenses, how much leeway the police have.
Right.
There's this memorable anecdote the paper mentions about an Italian immigrant arrested for carrying a candy bar. Apparently, the police thought it was a weapon, and he couldn't explain himself in English.
Wow. Just for a candy bar.
Yeah. It really highlights the potential for prejudice in enforcement, doesn't it? And interestingly, these higher rates for minor crimes, they even seem to extend to the second generation, the children of immigrants.
And did it matter where immigrants came from? Did the data break down by country of origin?
It did. In 1904, commitment rates for those major offenses varied quite a bit by country.
Right.
Groups that had higher rates, like immigrants from Mexico and Italy at that time,
Hmm.
they also tended to have lower literacy rates, less English proficiency, and lower manufacturing wages.
Okay, so socioeconomic factors seem linked.
Exactly. It fits pretty well with standard theories of crime, which often connect things like poverty and lack of opportunity to criminal activity. And conversely, groups like Scandinavians, who generally arrived with higher skills and earned higher wages, they had lower commitment rates.
Got it. So a really nuanced picture historically, and one that changed over decades.
Yeah.
Now let's jump forward. What does more recent research, say late 20th century, tell us about this link?
It tells a strikingly different story, actually. Recent studies, including work out of Chicago and research by well-known economists like Butcher and Peel, they've pretty consistently found that immigrants today generally have lower rates of crime and incarceration than native-born individuals.
Lower rates. That feels like a direct contradiction to the persistent perception.
It really is. And a key takeaway here is that the most recently arrived immigrants actually show the lowest relative rates of being institutionalized. And that gap, the difference between immigrant and native rates, it actually grew between 1980 and 2000.
Wow. So the data strongly challenges that old narrative.
It does. It suggests the ongoing debate often operates quite separately from the empirical evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears then. Fast forward to today, or rather very recently. Since January 2025, we've seen the second Trump administration roll out some immediate and frankly sweeping executive actions on immigration.
Yeah, sweeping is definitely the word. It's been a significant, very rapid shift in policy across the board.
Was the main thrust.
The overarching theme seems to be a very strong focus on deterrence and restrictive enforcement. It touches almost every part of the immigration system. You can sort of break it down into key pillars.
Okay.
So first, there's a real hardening of border security and entry controls. Right away, a national emergency declared at the southern border.
Proclamation 10886, I think?
Right. And then another proclamation suspending entry for people deemed involved in an invasion, plus a big expansion of expedited removal.
Which means quicker deportations without a full court hearing.
Exactly. For certain individuals caught near the border or who can't prove they've been here continuously for 2 years.
And it's not just about the border itself, right?
Yeah.
There are changes to how people apply.
Oh, absolutely. A major overhaul there. For instance, the migrant protection protocols, often called Remain in Mexico, that's been reinstated for asylum seekers. They have to wait outside the U.S.
And that CBP One app.
Terminated. The mobile app that let migrants schedule appointments at ports of entry, gone. Apparently within an hour of the inauguration, and all existing appointments were canceled.
Wow. Okay, pillar 2.
Refugee admissions. There was an executive order suspending new refugee admissions for 90 days. There are limited case-by-case exceptions, but it's a significant cut.
What was the justification given?
The administration cited the need to protect U.S. resources and ensure assimilation. But, the practical effect is it drastically reduces legal pathways for people seeking refuge.
And then what about enforcement inside the country? Interior enforcement.
Big changes there, too. The policy known as catch and release is out. It's been replaced by catch and detain.
Maybe.
Meaning, essentially, all undocumented immigrants apprehended are now subject to criminal charges and detention while they await deportation. No more releasing people with a notice to appear in court later, for the most part.
And empowering local authorities.
Yes. Another executive order authorizes state and local law enforcement to act as immigration officers in certain circumstances. Plus, as we mentioned, expanding expedited removal further into the interior for those here less than 2 years without proof of lawful entry. And a halt to public benefits for undocumented immigrants.
Okay, this is a lot. What else? Targeting specific groups.
Yes. A really significant move involved designating certain transnational criminal organizations, cartels like Tren de Aragua, MS-13, some Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations.
Terrorist organizations. What does that allow?
It allows the administration to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798.
Wait, 1798?
Yeah,
That's old.
very old. It's a wartime law, technically. Invoking it allows for potentially even faster deportations for members of these groups, possibly bypassing some standard court proceedings. Its applicability here is definitely being debated legally.
Wasn't there also the Lake and Riley Act?
Yes, that mandates detention for immigrants, even legal ones sometimes, if they're charged with or convicted of certain crimes. It also gives states the ability to sue the federal government if they feel immigration laws aren't being enforced adequately.
Then there's the whole birthright citizenship debate, which flared up again.
Right. Executive Order 14160. It puts forward the administration's view that the 14th Amendment doesn't automatically grant citizenship to children born in the U.S. if their parents aren't citizens or permanent residents, or if they are, say, undocumented, basically arguing they aren't fully subject to its jurisdiction.
That sounds like a major constitutional challenge.
It is, and it's already facing legal challenges and has been blocked by preliminary injunctions. It's a huge, controversial legal question.
And data use. How is technology playing into this?
The administration is reportedly using combined data from different federal agencies, Social Security, IRS, Health and Human Services, maybe even health or car insurance, claims data to aid in enforcement.
Wow. And detention. Where are people being held?
Well, besides existing facilities, there's been exploration of using sites abroad. Reports mention potentially Central America, Africa, even Guantanamo Bay has been floated, though that's highly controversial. And some specific agreements, like using facilities in El Salvador, have generated controversy too.
El Salvador's CCOT prison, right? Wasn't there an issue there?
Yes, involving a Salvadoran judge's order regarding a specific individual, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, which was allegedly ignored due to an administrative error. That sparked concern.
And speaking of controversial proposals,
Right.
sending U.S. citizens to foreign prisons.
That was floated, yes. The idea of sending U.S. citizens convicted of certain serious crimes to serve time in prisons like CCOT in El Salvador. Legal experts immediately raised huge objections, citing the Constitution, Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment, the First Step Act.
Unsurprisingly. Okay, any other major pillars? Travel restrictions.
Yes. First, an order enhancing vetting for foreign nationals, followed by Proclamation 10949 in June 2025. This restricts entry from 12 countries and partially restricts it from 7 others based on stated security concerns.
And the international ripple effects.
They're being felt. Reports mention a reverse migratory flow, potentially people leaving the U.S. Migration numbers through transit countries like Colombia have reportedly decreased. And there's this growing concern about a potential brain drain.
Brain drain. Scientists leaving.
Yeah, polls, like one mentioned in Nature, suggest a number of scientists are considering leaving the U.S. due to the policy environment. And you see European countries actively trying to recruit that talent. So yeah, these actions represent a really sweeping reorientation of U.S. immigration policy with pretty significant consequences both here and abroad.
It's a whirlwind, absolutely. Okay, so that's the immediate policy landscape. But let's zoom out again. How do these actions stack up against the sort of bigger picture, the broader economic and social realities of immigration?
Right, because immigration, as we said, it's so hotly debated, often with, let's be honest, pretty low-quality public discourse.
Yeah.
But when you look at the high-quality analysis, the academic work, it reveals just immense complexity.
So where do we start with that complexity? Maybe a global snapshot.
Good idea. Globally, migration is still relatively rare. Only about 3.5% of the world's population lives outside their country of birth.
Only 3.5%. That feels low.
It does, doesn't it? Now, the U.S. hosts the most immigrants in raw numbers, about 48.2 million. But as a percentage of our population, that foreign-born share is around 15%.
Which is high, but not the highest globally.
Exactly. It's moderate compared to some other developed nations, though, interestingly, it is approaching the historic high we saw back in 1890.
Okay, so why do people move? What are the big drivers?
Well, the number one driver, overwhelmingly, is economic opportunity. Income and wages. There's this concept called the place premium.
Place premium.
Yeah, it basically measures how much a worker's productivity, and therefore their income, can increase just by moving from a low productivity country to a high productivity one. The lecture notes mention an example.
Yeah.
A worker moving from, say, Nigeria to the U.S. could see their output increase maybe 16 times over.
16 times.
Yeah.
Just by changing location.
It's a powerful illustration of global inequality and economic opportunity. Other factors matter too, of course. There's something called the gravity model in migration studies.
Like physics.
Sort of. It suggests migration flows are influenced by the economic size of the destination country and how close it is geographically. Bigger and closer means more pull.
Okay.
And then there's cultural affinity, language, and existing communities, diasporas. People naturally prefer to move where they can communicate easily and where there's already a network from their home country to help them get settled.
But you mentioned earlier, despite all these powerful reasons to move, regulation is a huge factor.
Right. Oh, absolutely massive. Strict regulation drastically cuts down migration flows, even when all the economic and social factors are pushing for high migration. Think about it. The demand to migrate to the U.S. is enormous. One estimate suggests 158 million people globally would choose the U.S. first if they could move.
158 million, compared to how many are actually admitted legally.
Roughly 1 million lawful permanent residents per year, plus temporary workers and others. So the demand vastly outstrips the supply of legal slots.
Which explains why illegal immigration persists, despite the risks.
Exactly. The potential gains for individuals, that place premium, are just so vast that many are willing to undertake huge costs and dangers.
This leads to a really critical point you touched on: global wealth. How does immigration actually impact the world's economy?
Fundamentally, it comes down to comparative advantage, but on a global scale. Just like trade allows countries to specialize in what they do best, immigration allows people with different skills to move where they can be most productive.
So like the example from the notes, American computer programmers and Mexican childcare workers.
Precisely. Both groups can specialize, trade their services indirectly, and boost overall productivity. This increases what economists call gross world product, or GWP.
And the potential gains are significant.
Hugely significant. Economist Michael Clemens did some famous work on this. He described the potential gains from freer labor mobility as like finding trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk.
Trillion-dollar bills, seriously.
His estimates suggest that eliminating barriers to international labor mobility could boost GWP by anywhere from 67% to maybe 147%.
Wow. How does that compare to, say, removing trade barriers?
Far, far larger. The potential gains from freeing up labor movement dwarf the estimated gains from removing all remaining barriers to trade or capital flows.
That's staggering. But what about the common fear that large-scale immigration would just swamp receiving countries, overwhelm infrastructure, culture, etc.?
That's a very real concern people have. But economist Paul Collier talks about diaspora dynamics. His model suggests migration doesn't usually happen as a sudden flood. It tends to build gradually. It starts slow, maybe with pioneers, then networks form, information flows back, and it snowballs over time. This gradual process gives families, businesses, governments time to adjust. It allows for integration and helps realize those massive long-term economic gains without sudden shocks.
Are there examples of this working maybe within countries?
Yes, absolutely. Think about internal migration. China and India saw incredible urbanization and economic growth when they loosened restrictions on people moving from rural areas to cities.
Right.
Conversely, look at the U.S. now. Some research suggests that restrictive housing regulations in our most productive cities are actually causing net migration away from high productivity areas towards lower productivity ones.
Oh, yeah.
That costs the U.S. economy potentially billions, maybe trillions in lost GDP.
So internal migration barriers are hurting us, while international barriers are preventing huge global gains.
Right.
But who actually benefits? The distributional effects, who gains, who loses, that's often the sticking point domestically, isn't it?
It really is, and it's important to be clear here. While admitting more low-skilled immigrants might increase inequality within a rich country like the U.S.
Because you're adding more people at the lower end of the income scale.
Exactly. But from a global perspective, it generally reduces overall world inequality because those immigrants are drastically increasing their own incomes, moving from deep poverty to, well, less poverty.
So we need to distinguish between national and global inequality.
We do. And we also need to avoid what some call the arithmetic fallacy.
Arithmetic fallacy.
Yeah, the mistaken idea that immigration is only good if it raises the average income, or per capita GDP, of the receiving country. Think about it. If 1 million low-earning immigrants arrive, they might lower the mathematical average income.
Even if they become much richer than they were, and even if the native population also becomes slightly richer.
Precisely. Both groups can gain individually, but the average can still go down. So per capita GDP isn't always the best measure of the overall benefit.
Okay, but what about the impact on native workers' wages and jobs? That's probably the core economic fear for many people.
Understandably, the research here is quite nuanced, and there's been a lot of it. Generally, the consensus finds that the negative impact of immigration on native wages is small.
How small?
Like a typical estimate might be that a 10% increase in the labor supply due to immigration might lead to maybe a 1% decrease in wages for native workers in the short run, sometimes even smaller.
Okay, small, but still potentially negative for some.
In the short run, possibly for directly competing workers. But in the longer run, many studies, like influential work by Ottaviano and Perry, suggest that Native workers, even those with less education, like high school dropouts, can actually see slight gains.
Gains. How?
Because of that comparative advantage idea again, immigrants often complement Native workers' skills rather than just competing. They might take jobs that Natives are moving out of, allowing Natives to specialize in other, often better paying tasks. The group that might see some negative wage impact is often previous immigrants who have similar skills.
Interesting. Okay, what about the fiscal impact? The taxes versus services argument. Are immigrants a net drain on the public purse?
That's another huge point of debate. Immigrants, like everyone else, consume public services, schools, roads, healthcare, and they also pay taxes, income, payroll, sales taxes.
But do they pay enough to cover their costs?
It's complicated. Tax payments obviously vary hugely with income, and the U.S. tax system is very progressive, meaning higher earners pay a much larger share.
Right.
Plus, some major government spending, like national defense, is what economists call non-rival. An immigrant benefits from it, but their presence doesn't really increase the total cost.
Okay, defense is one thing. What else complicates it?
Age is a big one. Immigrants often arrive during their prime working years, meaning they contribute taxes immediately without having cost the system for, say, K-12 education here.
So they skip the expensive childhood years, fiscally speaking.
To some extent, yes. And crucially, you have to consider the long term, including the taxes paid by their children and grandchildren, the descendants.
So the National Academy of Sciences did a major study on this, right? What was their bottom line?
Their findings were really illuminating, looking over a long time horizon, like 75 years, and including the descendants.
Yeah.
They found that immigrants, particularly those who are more educated or arrive younger, generally have a positive net fiscal impact. They pay more in taxes over their lifetimes than they consume in services.
Positive impact.
Yeah.
Even compared to similar natives.
Yes, this was maybe the most striking finding. Immigrants are often fiscally better than native-born individuals in the same age and education categories.
How can that be?
Well, think about that 25-year-old high school graduate immigrant example from the notes. The NAS estimated they provide a positive net present value of about $72,000 over 75 years.
Okay.
A native-born 25-year-old high school graduate, having already received public education and potentially other benefits, is often a net negative fiscally over their lifetime in these models.
Wow. That directly challenges that famous Milton Friedman line, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You cannot simultaneously have free migration in a welfare state.
It does complicate it significantly. It suggests that maybe the issue isn't migration itself, but how the welfare state is structured. You could use what are sometimes called keyhole solutions.
Keyhole solutions.
Yeah, targeted policies. Like you could restrict eligibility for certain welfare benefits for new arrivals for a period, addressing the fiscal concern directly without necessarily restricting entry itself.
Okay, let's shift to the cultural and social side. Assimilation, social cohesion. There's this common perception, for example, that recent immigrants, maybe unlike past waves, aren't learning English. Is that borne out by the data?
Not really, no. While first-generation adult immigrants might struggle with fluency sometimes.
Sure, learning a new language as an adult is hard.
Exactly. But the data consistently shows that their children, the second generation, and certainly the third generation, achieve near universal English fluency. It actually mirrors historical patterns of linguistic assimilation quite closely.
And what about education? How do children of immigrants fare?
They actually tend to show higher rates of educational upward mobility compared to children of native-born parents who have similar levels of parental education.
Higher upward mobility. That's interesting. What about social trust? Does immigration erode trust in communities?
Research there is quite mixed, honestly. Some studies find small negative effects on trust, others find none, or even positive effects in some contexts, but often the measured effects are pretty small. And again, when you look at subsequent generations, trust levels seem to assimilate towards the norm. Moderate to high trust assimilation for the second and third generations.
So the fears about lack of assimilation might be somewhat overblown compared to the data.
The data suggests assimilation is happening, maybe at different paces for different things, but the long-term trajectory seems similar to past waves.
Okay, finally, let's touch on the academic view. From a philosophical or ethical standpoint, where does the consensus tend to lie on immigration policy?
Well, it's diverse, of course, but broadly speaking, many major philosophical frameworks end up favoring more liberal immigration policies.
Like which ones?
Utilitarianism, which focuses on maximizing overall well-being. Given those huge potential GWP gains, it often leans towards openness. Egalitarianism, focused on equality, especially global equality, also tends to favor migration as a tool to reduce poverty.
Libertarianism.
Strongly favors freedom of movement as a basic right. Cost-benefit analysis, if done comprehensively, usually shows large net benefits. Even meritocracy, focused on talent, would favor bringing in skilled individuals.
So what argues against liberalization philosophically?
Well, there's citizenism, the idea that a nation's primary obligation is to its current citizens, which might justify restrictions or those keyhole solutions to protect citizen interests. And then there's the precautionary principle.
Which is
Basically, the idea that if an action has potentially large, unknown negative consequences, you should be cautious. Some apply it to argue against radical immigration liberalization because the societal impacts are complex and hard to predict perfectly.
Though critics might say that principles applied inconsistently, right? We don't always apply it to other policies with uncertain outcomes.
That's a fair critique, yeah. It's often selectively invoked in policy debates.
Okay, wow. This deep dive has really taken us across a huge landscape. We've gone from, historical crime statistics, which were more complex than maybe we thought,
Right.
to the really dramatic current policy shifts, and then into these intricate economic and social realities, looking at global wealth, wages, fiscal impacts, assimilation.
And what seems to stand out again and again is this potential disconnect between common perceptions or political rhetoric and what the bulk of the empirical evidence actually suggests.
Absolutely. The data often points towards immense potential benefits from immigration, like that huge potential for global wealth creation and poverty reduction.
Yeah, and at the same time, many of the most common fears, like massive increases in crime or immigrants being a huge fiscal burden, they don't seem to be consistently supported by the most robust evidence, especially when you look long-term or include descendants.
So it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to mull over, doesn't it?
Def-
If those potential global gains are so incredibly large, and if many of the standard fears aren't strongly backed by data, what fundamental values are really driving our current, often quite restrictive, immigration policies?
Yeah, what's the underlying calculus?
And looking forward, how could a different approach, maybe more open, but still thoughtfully managed, potentially reshape our world for the better? How do we actually strike that balance between legitimate national concerns and these vast global opportunities?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is something for all of us to think about.